Hello, and I have the honor to ask some questions and participate in this conversation with Peter and Todd, who are really the leaders of the practitioners of a new approach to innovation in the world. And we were speaking before and talking about how everybody's looking out at the world saying things have to change. So this concern for innovation is widespread, pervasive, and we need some help there, in my opinion. And so the book that Peter and I wrote years ago, called The Innovator's Way, was a serious attempt to answer some questions about what is innovation and how do you do it in a way that actually works in the world, rather than be what I would call fast food. You know, the tips and techniques that people are satisfied with, but they don't have a lot of nutrition. And so let me open with a question here. I'll let Peter start. Peter, take us back to The Innovator's Way. Why was it written? What was the problem in the world that we saw that The Innovator's Way was addressing?
Well, Bob, I think the thing to remember the most was that we were hearing a lot of stories about people wanting to do innovation and be successful with it. And we kept coming across data from surveys of businesses that suggested that 96% of the innovation projects in the companies failed to meet their financial goals. And so from the company point of view, they failed. And that sort of suggested an industry-wide 4% success rate. And the usual logic of trying to cope with that, what they called taking many shots on goals. So, you do the math, that means you have to have 25 projects in your company so that one of them is likely to succeed. And most companies don't have the kind of resources necessary to do that. They have to make a bet on one or two things and hope for the best. And the other thing we saw at the time seemed to be that there were people around who were successful at innovation. They defied that 4% failure rate, or success rate, and they were much more successful than the average. And so you and I started to ask, they must have some skill set that we don't know about.
Right.
What is it? And we started to investigate that. So we looked at all sorts of different examples of innovation and investigated and started to see a pattern in it, which in our book we came to call the prime innovation pattern. And we mapped out 8 practices in the book that lead somebody through that pattern and increase the probability of success by a considerable amount.
Yeah.
So that was the kind of the place I remember how we got started on that.
Yeah. I recall that time. And as you're describing the failure rate and the success rate, one of the interpretations we made is the failure rate wasn't just due to incompetent people, but really blind spots. People weren't paying attention to the right things. And it's that we said, okay, what's the blind spot? What are the interpretations that people have been satisfied with that don't work? And then going back to that question, what really produced success? Can you, and I'll ask Todd from his experience with teaching from this framework also, what are the perspectives that really illuminate this world of innovation in a way that produces effective action versus those perspectives that don't?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I would start off by saying that in many ways, the transformation comes when people realize that it's not something that's to be intellectualized. It's not something that I'm going to sit off in a room or go be a hermit and come up with the grand idea and then have it emerge fully formed, but that it's a process and it's a set of practices that anyone can do. And what we find is all of our students in some ways find their voice, and they're always surprised when they're like, yeah, but I didn't invent that idea. I can't be the innovator. And we're like, no, absolutely. all you're doing it is driving it into practice. And so you're the leader that brings these things together, that senses the concerns. And so much of what we see in the failed innovation is where someone comes up with a great idea, but has no idea who to talk to, whether they should have a conversation, what kind of offers they might make. And it's really interesting in a variety of different fora. We've got engineers that have a thing that don't know what to do with it. We've got leaders in organizations that have concerns and don't know how to get them addressed. And frankly, don't know how to articulate it in a way that would allow others to come and join them. And so that's the transformation that we've seen in the course, is people being able to find their voice, and perhaps more importantly, truly listen to others in a way that generates those new possibilities for action that were not there or apparent to anyone prior to that conversation.
Awesome. Awesome. Peter, anything that you would add to that?
Well, what we do with our, Bob, one of the things we have done with our students is something suggested in our book. On the first day of the course, we asked them to complete the self-assessment. So we walk them briefly through the 8 practices and say, this is what we're going to be studying. And we ask them to go home and sit down and think about it and rate themselves on a scale from 1 to 5 of degree of competence, shall we say, at the practice. And the 5 being the best and the 1 being, I never heard of it before until today. So they do that. We also ask them to ask a colleague or a friend to make a similar assessment for them, just based on the little information we've given. And they often find some discrepancies there. So they find things where they think they're strong and their colleague thinks they're weak, or vice versa. So this is a very informative exercise for them. And invariably what happens is, as they get deeper into the course and start trying to do the practices on their own innovation project, they start finding that whatever rating they had given themselves at the start was too generous. They say, now I'm getting what you're driving at. I'm seeing myself having trouble sensing a concern. I'm seeing myself getting in front of my colleagues and trying to tell my visioning story. I'm seeing myself choke up when I need to make an offer. I'm seeing myself get stopped by a resistor who gives me a gratuitous negative assessment, and so on. And they say, now we're getting it. Now we see that there's a way to deal with these things. And you've given us a precise language for thinking about it and acting with it.
Great, great. So you've mentioned the practices, and your descriptions, both of you, show that the core of this innovation approach, it's not about understanding new ideas. It's about new behaviors, actions that actually produce the result of innovation. So Peter, why don't you define innovation and open the conversation for you and Todd about why are there 8 practices? What's unique about these 8 practices that produce innovation?
Back when we were formulating the book, we said we had to start with the question, what is innovation? If we're going to be teaching it, talking about it, we better know what we're talking about. So we did a lot of research into looking at what are the common theories of innovation, like pipeline or funnel, or innovation cell and diffusion and a couple of other things like that. And these are very popular theories. If they say if you can manage your company or your project according to one of these models, you'll succeed in getting innovation. And yet you look out in the marketplace and you're only getting 4% success rate from all of that. So everybody's trying hard and they're not getting there. So we looked at successful innovations, and we looked closely at what were the innovators doing. We interviewed them, we read their stories in their memoirs or whatever, and we started seeing things like they were sensing concerns in their community and responding to them. And that's the start of the innovation. And a lot of those things, a lot of innovations began with somebody making a response to a concern rather than inventing an idea.
Mm.
Okay, so that all the popular innovation stories all start with the notion that somebody invented an idea. Somebody came up with an idea and then we ran it through a pipeline or a funnel or an innovation cell or a diffusion process, and we got it into practice. But the fact of the matter is, when you look at the stories that people were telling, they were saying, I was responding to a concern.
Yeah.
And sometimes I found there was an idea out there from somebody else that helped me respond to that concern. But that's what I was doing to get started. So, we put that in our book, and Todd and I have worked on it a lot, that a lot of people imagine that they understand a concern in their head, but they don't actually understand the concern because they haven't talked with anybody in their community.
Yes.
And that's a blind spot, and we spend a lot of time waking them up to it. Todd, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to put a point on it, the idea of innovation as the adoption of a new practice in a community completely changes the landscape of what's in the realm of the possible, because it's, again, focusing on the who and what is driving them. What is that thing that buoys them up? The other piece that I would highlight of all of the 8 practices, some have mastered, sensing or envisioning or offering. Most have not. Most have not thought about how to drive adoption or sustained adoption. And then there's this leading thing. And as you would imagine, people have a concept of what leading might mean, but very often those concepts of leadership are almost antithetical to innovation. And instead of it being, almost a command and control, which in many large companies or government bureaucracies, it's very much that sense. And realizing that actually the leader must be that person that is most sensitive, the one that's most capable of sensing what needs to be done, and then telling a really powerful story that mobilizes people in a different way. Because if the standard practice in the organization worked, there'd be no need for the innovation. And yet many of us we satisfy in our organizations and in our lives by not adopting new practices because we're not sure of what value that's going to give us. And that's what the leader does, is help define the space of possibility that we can then move into.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I remember from our design of the 8 practices is our question with identifying a practice is, what is essential and unavoidable in the process? And when we talk about the 8 practices, we're not just talking about concepts to understand, and we're not even talking about actions to do. We're talking about results that have to show up in the process. So it makes it very hands-on and challenges us from our conceptual, considering learning to be conceptual understanding, to actions and behaviors that actually produce a desired result. And what I'm hearing as we're talking here is that you found the 8 practices have worked. I don't hear that you've said it, though there should have been 25. And that I think that's an important conclusion to the work you've done over the years. You care to comment on that?
We've in our teaching found that we now divide the 8 practices into 2 parts.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is the first 5 of the 8, the sensing, the envisioning, the offering, the adopting, and sustaining. We consider those the basic practices.
Right.
Everybody's got to learn that. Everybody can see that they need to learn that. And we spend half of our time talking about them and having our students do things with those things to discover how well they do them.
Yeah.
And then the more advanced practices are ones we now summarize as mobilizing and navigating. But in the book, we talked about leading, executing, and embodying. And so those are all included in what we mean by mobilizing and navigating. So, we actually spend a lot of time on even though we're doing it in a Zoom environment, on the somatic aspects of these practices. How does your body react when you're trying to do the practice?
Yes.
And does it take you somewhere else by a conditioned tendency that you didn't want to go, but you found yourself there?
Yeah.
So, in our experience, we found it's better to first discuss the 5 basic ones and then take them on into the more advanced ones after they get the somatic part and they get the linguistic part of what we're doing.
Yeah.
We've also found over time that in a very real way, there's 2 sort of even more fundamental practices underneath these 8 that support all of them. One of them I call the storytelling practice,
Mhm.
and the other one just being aware of the practice of making and eliciting commitments. And
Well, you've mentioned here the word somatic,
yes,
and one of the principles of this approach, we even mentioned it as what we'd call generative, which means it's actions that generate desired results, is that the learning of a performance art, which innovation is, it's not a domain of understanding or scholarship, it's something that has to be performed, is we use the term embodied learning. Embodied learning means you have skill. You can actually produce the result rather than understand the concepts. That's huge in our culture, particularly in the work that I do in leadership. So many people have had a history where learning some concepts or reading a book is kind of the practice, but it never really produces the skill. And so in all this work you've done for so many years of teaching and applying this, and clearly deepened your understanding, what have you found about the dimension of embodied learning, the necessity to develop new habits, and the time and patience to do that, so that people don't just say, well, this doesn't work because a half-hour read didn't give me my magic wand. And how have you created that relevance for that work so that people can integrate it into their skill set?
Peter,
Todd?
if I can, I want to brag on you, because one of the things we do at the very beginning of the course is we read the Beginner's Creed, which Peter wrote, that really helps ground them that I am a beginner. And in doing that, they realize that there is a skill to be learned. And throughout the course that we have, we give them these insights into, what you're doing is more akin to a musician or a craftsman than it is to someone that's going to read a book and, operate a machine. It's not that. It's, you are actually going to have to do these things over time. And by grounding them that they're a beginner and that there is in fact a spectrum. And so we kind of talk through that spectrum, the skills hierarchy, that they can then begin to see progress. I would also say that in the course, the coaching sessions are where that's one of the key elements where our students have those transformative moments, because we begin to elicit from them what are the experiences that they've had that cause some of those conditioned tendencies. And in fact, in many of our coaching sessions, we're able to identify very quickly, do you know that you have this conditioned tendency? And most people don't even recognize they have them. But then as they begin to uncover where it came from and perhaps why they have it, it really allows for them to transform in a way that they could not have imagined at the beginning of the course. And in part, it's because they didn't have the language before we started the course. The coaching comes, after we've done about 5 or 6 sessions, and they're at that point where they're like, why am I not, growing more rapidly than I would have imagined? And that's where the transformation really begins to occur, is they've tried to do the practices, They haven't been as skillful as they thought. And now they're trying to figure out why they're having that breakdown.
Mm.
Peter?
Yeah. Your question is about the somatic aspects in here and how important it is. So yeah, it's true that we start out with the beginner's creed because we want to remind them that they're coming into a new domain in which they see things happening, but they don't understand how to do them. So, but when we get about halfway through, we also recognize that they're not going to be beginners forever. And we have them sit down and look at Hubert Dreyfus's movie called Being in the World, which is a set of scenarios, cameo shots of 7 different masters at work. And you really get an idea of how awesome mastery looks when you see it. And no matter what domain it's in. And in between the scenes of the masters doing their masterful things, there are interviews with teachers and philosophers that are trying to give you insight into what these people are doing with language that enables them to be masters. And so we want our students to realize that there's a whole spectrum from being a beginner to being a master, and it's okay for them to aspire to be a master, and they're not going to be a beginner forever. So we're not trying to lock them into being a beginner.
Yes.
One of the reasons we've done this is tell them about being a beginner is because a lot of times they're going to have to learn something new, some new domain they weren't quite familiar with, but seems to be relevant to their desired innovation. And they have to be a beginner with that. They have to be comfortable with not knowing and asking questions. And they will have a skill of being able to come up to speed much faster than an unskilled beginner. But we like to joke a little bit that they have to be an expert beginner.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. And I know that many of your students are people who are very mature and accomplished in their careers.
Right.
They've taken on huge challenges, big promises, and been in very senior leadership positions. And I think this is important for the understanding of beginner. Doesn't mean we're dealing with people who are not highly skilled and accomplished. We're dealing with people who are entering a new domain. And in fact, it's the senior people who understand the process of developing the skills they already have, who we find are often the most skillful at being a beginner at something new.
Mm-hmm.
And can you say a little more about what are some of these new, not just skills, but habits, not just doing innovation, but habits that actually inform, how they see their world and move in it as leaders and innovators.
Todd?
Yeah, I'd love to jump on that. Bob, one of the things that as we think through how we move in the world, a lot of the leaders that we have that have been great, incredibly successful, the challenge is what got them there won't take them to where they need to be in the future. They've reached a plateau that if they continue to do what they've done in the past, it's not going to move them forward. And so I think as we conceive of this, the ability to listen deeply and listen a concern, again, not identify problems, which is what a lot of people stop with, but identifying the concern is the deep practice that people need to understand and actually do on a recurrent basis so that they get better at it. The other piece that I would tell you, and this is something Peter was referring to, that storytelling function is one that is often dismissed amongst especially our hard science engineers. They're like, people should just be able to see how good this is and immediately intuit what they need to do with it. And helping them realize that they've got to create a world that is inviting other people to join it. That that's the skill. That's the thing that people need. Again, a lot of practice at, and it's one that typically they come into our course not being very good at.
Yes.
And again, it's not because they're bad people or they were bad leaders. They were great leaders. It was just not as much of a requirement when they were trying to lead an organization with people they could touch. Once you begin leading at a higher level, and you really are going to have to move people that are disparate in both geography and perhaps asynchronous in time, you really have to have a powerful storytelling practice in order to be effective.
Fabulous.
Right, and that storytelling doesn't end, you know, our second practice is the envisioning practice, which is to tell your story of the future world.
Yes.
But do it in a way that people, when they hear the story, wind up saying, I'd like to be part of that.
That's exactly right.
But this comes up all the time because it happens as you're trying to do the offering practice, for example. Somebody will ask you questions about why does this apply to them? Or how does this help them? And if you can't tell them a story about their own future or help them tell a story about their own future, they miss the point. So this comes up all the time. It comes up when you're dealing with early adopters. It comes up when you're dealing with majority adopters. You always have to be able to tell a story and attune it to the people you're talking to. So you always have to be sensing their concerns so you can attune it to them.
Yeah.
These are not discrete practices. These are things you do all the time. You're always sensing, you're always envisioning, you're always offering, you're always working with adopters, and you're in some ways cycling around endlessly between the different practices, trying to make each one produce its desired outcome so you can get your innovation.
Yeah. Beautiful. You've already touched on a lot of points about what's possible in this webinar series.
Mhm.
But I'm just going to ask you to do a summary about what's possible in this webinar series that people are going to get that they won't get by just reading the book.
Well, I'd say, part of what we found in our teaching is that just learning the language action, and then learning the language of these practices, learning the language of sensing, offering, and so on, is lifts a veil of blindness off of them. And once you learn the language, you're already on a path to being able to do something different. Now, the other part of it, which is you have to practice these things, and we do that in our course because we have students bring their innovation project with them, and their objective by the end of the course is to produce early adoption of their innovation. And so, they have to get good enough at each of the practices that they can get that far. People in the webinar, they're kind of on their own. We can't lead them through the practices. We can give them a taste here and there, but if they want to go deeper, they're going to need to say, I need to pay attention and try these practices out every day until I get good at it.
Great. Thank
Bob,
you.
I'd approach it from a slightly different way as well. If you're interested in the martial arts, you can watch the Bruce Lee movie, you can read Jeet Kune Do, and in fact, you can play the video games that use the martial arts techniques. And I actually had a subordinate who worked for me one time who I said, so have you ever done the martial arts? And he said, oh, I'm fantastic at it. And I was like, oh, this is great. Yeah. Show me what you know. And he started booting up his video game. And I'm like, no, it's a practice. It's in the body and you have to do it. And you have to have someone of greater skill who can correct you, because the worst thing in the world is you read the book, you begin to apply it without coaching, without someone who's guiding you through those practices, and you end up in a really bad place because you have misapplied the practices and again, it wasn't because the book was wrong. It wasn't because your intention was wrong. It was because you didn't have someone to coach you through those practices and help you on your journey. And I think, if we think of it that way, the book is a great first step. It's a great place to ground what we're doing. But at the end of the day, it's the doing of it in class with peers that want to support you, with coaches who are there to guide you on the way. That's the key to the course. Does that make sense, Bob?
Absolutely. In fact, from our work in the generative leadership field, this is the foundation of learning of any performance art.
Right.
And we have to get it in the body as skill. We can't, and the way to do that is don't fly solo. One of the biggest issues that I find in our culture is everybody's been trained to be a solo artist, and yet innovation is an interactive group phenomena. It's a community practice, and so we have to do it there.
Absolutely.
And actually get the eyes of people who can see what we can't see, because being a beginner means you don't see everything. So that's great. I've got one more question for you.
Sometimes I like to tell a little story about myself, which seems sort of inconsequential, but actually teaches the point that Todd was trying to make.
Yes.
Excuse me. There's this book by Malcolm Gladwell that says if you do something for 10,000 hours, you'll become an expert, or at least it suggests that, because all the experts that he studied spent at least 10,000 hours learning to be an expert. Well, when I was a young man, as I was entering college, I had a summer job as a golf caddy, and I decided I wanted to become a scratch golfer. And one of my roommates, who was a big athlete, said the only way you're going to learn to be a scratch golfer is to play golf every day. So I said, okay. And for most every day in senior year of college and most every day in graduate school, literally for 5 years, every day, winter, summer, rain, snow, whatever, I was out there playing golf. And not once, I think in that whole time, I achieved a score better than 80 one time. And that's nowhere near scratch. So I finally said, I think I need help from a pro. So I paid a pro, and he started giving me lessons. And he even walked around with me on a round. And he finally said at the end of that round, he said, I can't help you. You've learned so many bad habits. I'm never going to train them out of you. So thank you. Sorry, I can't do anything with you. So if I quit golf after that because it was also hurting my golf, because my bad habits were not good for my back. But the point was that I'd spent this enormous amount of time, 10,000 hours or more, learning how to be a scratch golfer. And all I did was learn a bunch of bad habits that kept me from being a scratch golfer.
Wow.
And made it impossible for me to become, in the opinion of a pro.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I've taken the 10,000 hours story myself in my teaching and said to people that it sounds like a big challenge, but you're spending 10,000 hours anyway, just by living. Your body's practicing every day, whether you're paying attention or not. And you're absolutely right, Peter. You can be developing habits that support what you want to achieve and habits that get in the way, but you're practicing already. So it's not about deciding to spend the 10,000 hours. It's paying attention to what you're already practicing. And I sometimes throw in the comment, I know people who've spent 10,000 hours and really mastered resentment, for example. And so it's about paying attention to what you're doing, and then having this question, well, what would I practice every day that would have me develop the skill that's producing the outcomes I really care about? And that brings me to my last question, which is, we can talk about innovation and the skills and the practice, and it sounds like, becoming professionally competent or doing well at work. But these skills we're talking about are human skills. They're life skills. And so how does learning innovation support people's ability to live a richer, fuller, more successful life that's not simply defined by their work?
Well, Todd and I have talked a lot about that. He can say some more from what he sees, but what I see there is we see it especially in the current time with the COVID, which has upended many work practices, has upended family practices, social practices, and so on. So we're literally in a situation where we have to innovate. In other words, design new practices that work, but we don't know what they're going to be.
Yes.
So we're faced with a fog of uncertainty, and we don't know how to move with the fog of uncertainty. And these practices that we teach actually give you navigational skills to move through the uncertainty and get to a goal. So the professional leaders, executives of companies, leaders of projects are not the only ones who are interested in innovation. We're all being forced into it. But not only that, a lot of us are involved in, our families and our civic organizations, our churches, our communities, political issues, and so on. And we all are interested in producing change. And we don't know how to do it, and we get frustrated by it. So these things help all those people too. So Todd and I have come to the point of view that what we're talking about is literally everyday practices of innovation. This is for everybody.
Beautiful. Thank you, Todd.
Yeah. We live life in relationship to others. And anytime you have a relationship, you are performing a set of practices. And Bob, I loved your story about some people have mastered resentment. They've mastered anger. And by engaging people and thinking through these practices, we have actually seen the transformation of not just how they move in the work environment, but how they move in their community, in their schools, with their children, with their spouses. And so it really begins to be a life change. One of the, couples, and I say we've had a couple of couples where the spouse took the course, started talking about it at home, and the other spouse said, I've got to go learn what you're learning because I can see it making a transformation in our life as a family.
Wow.
And that really, for me, highlighted how powerful what we have to offer could be for our community and for our nation. And I think, as Peter said, we're at a unique moment in time where we're dealing with some deep concerns about how do we deal with racism in our country? How do we deal with economic inequality? How do we deal with, a pandemic that's upending all of the ways that we've done things in the past? And these practices aren't just going to make a better bottom line for a business, which might be okay, but is ultimately perhaps unsatisfying. It's really about transforming how we interact with the world and create the world that we want to live in, which I think is perhaps even more powerful rather than living in the world as it is.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank you both for joining me in this conversation and exploring these questions. And again, it's very clear from what you said, this is an opportunity for people who are willing to step into a path of learning through practice that can be integrated into everyday life, that basically empowers them to expand the choices they have in, as you said, Todd, in the world they're creating, and to connect to that power that we already have. When we're in a story that we don't have that power, that just shows how powerful our stories are.
Exactly.
The issue is the story, not. And so if we can find those powerful stories and learn to live them, we can change, as you've been pointing out, the future, our families, our organizations, our results in our world. And I think that's something that when we stop and think and get out of our busyness, I think that's something everybody yearns for. And it's what the world is calling for today. So thank you. I look forward to the learning path you're going to share with people in this webinar series. And really, thank you very much for the conversation today.
Most welcome. Thank you.